I'm John Buchanan, and in this episode what we're going to do is to look at Logic's new mastering assistant. But before that, we should listen to the track we're going to be working on as we see what it's capable of giving our mixes at the output stage. Okay, so I'd like to be able to take credit for that track, but this is one of the, I think, new live loop sessions in 10.8. This is the Mark Ronson Crate Digger one, so if you want to go and play around with these sounds, they're yours to go and play around with. Okay, so what is Mastering Assistant? Well, the best thing to do is for me to open it and show you what it is. Now, what you'll find is that on the stereo output track, which is obviously available through the whole of the main mixer page, here, but also is likely to be available for you right here as well. We have this kind of grayed out new plugin. And this is the first time that I can remember that a kind of pre-existing plugin has been waiting in the wings for us to use in quite the way that Mastering Assistant is. And what you'll also notice is that if you go looking for this plugin in any of Logic's plugin folders, you won't find it. It's exclusively to be used on the stereo output track, and Apple don't want you putting it anywhere else. That makes sense when we think about mastering in the context of making sure that it affects our entire mix. So effectively it's waiting in the wings on this channel, and to instantiate it, all I have to do, just like any other plugin, is to click on it. And up it comes, and suddenly we get this new little pane here, but much more importantly, we also get this analysis process. So straight away on opening up this plugin, what effectively Logic is doing is analyzing the content that exists within the track, and what it's then going to do is to configure a range of modules which mastering engineers might use at the mastering stage, and Logic effectively is configuring a sort of process through a number of those different stages to improve your mix at the kind of mastering end of things. Okay, so what exactly is mastering? That's where we should start if we want to understand the mastering assistant. Okay, so the easiest way to think about mastering is, let's suppose what you want to do is to bring a collection of tracks together so that they make coherent sense as a body of work. And the best way to think about this may be, think about the sort of artists who co-write with a number of different producers. So what you've got maybe is a pop record that's been made with 6 different co-writers in 10 different studios, vocals recorded through different mics, different approaches to production, and suddenly there's a body of work which is going to be an album of material, and of course there are going to be tonal and dynamic differences between all of those tracks, and the mastering assistant's job, or mastering engineer's job, not the mastering assistant, that's a plugin. The mastering engineer's job is to make sure that all of that work makes sense together. And making sense together really means that there is a tonal balance, a dynamic balance, a width balance in terms of kind of stereo widening, that basically listening to that body of work from start to finish makes musical sense. And a mastering engineer's job is to make that happen from a musical perspective. But there's also a kind of technical aspect to mastering as well. So in other words, what we need to do is to be kind of readying the music that we're making so that it's fit for purpose. There's a slightly boring phrase, but nevertheless a useful one for the various ways in which music goes out into the world. So in other words, there are kind of requirements from a tonal perspective if you're going to have your record pressed on vinyl. It's going to be really important that the kind of bass end of things is managed so that the grooves of the records don't touch and the needle doesn't skip as you play back your record. And from a vinyl perspective, that's important. But from a digital perspective, if you want your music to go out on Apple Music or on Spotify or any of the other platforms, there are also volume balance requirements. It's important that the platform playback is consistent. So as we move from one track to another, as we skip from one track to another on Spotify, there aren't vast volume differences. And effectively, what mastering does is to ready music from that perspective so that effectively we're controlling the kind of dynamic levels of our tracks. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into talking about LUFS in just a little while. Okay, so there's a lot of background. Be honest, did you skip it? Did you? Okay, new chapter here. Okay, so Mastering Assistant, here it is, and this is what it looks like. So when we open up Mastering Assistant, what happens is that we immediately get greeted with this interface, and effectively the left-hand side of it is all about tone control. So what's happened is that Mastering Assistant has analysed the frequency content of this music from start to finish, and what it's done is to suggest a pretty dynamic, and what I mean by that is lots and lots of different nodes, a pretty dynamic EQ shape to kind of manage the tonal information contained within this mix. Mastering Assistant is suggesting that I might benefit from a bit of a boost around what looks like 40 hertz before maybe we get a little bit of a dip from a separate frequency perspective before we get more into the kind of treble end of things, and then we get a nice sweet little bump here at around sort of 10k, which is going to give us some air, and effectively you can see the suggested tonal shape, but also you can see down the right hand side exactly what these equate to from a dB point of view. So in other words, I can see that probably it looks like the maximum cut is going to be about 3 dB and the maximum boost is about the same in the opposite direction. So exactly what is Mastering Assistant basing its analysis on? Well, I'm guessing, because how can we really know? But effectively what it's doing is saying, okay, well, compared to other music out in the universe, maybe for the frequency content that exists within your track, you might want to be considering these particular areas. But it goes a little bit further. So the first thing to say is, if I like the idea of this shape, and I'm only going to know that when I press play, I have a chance either to say, okay, broadly I like what it's analysed and what it's suggesting, but I don't want as much of it as that. So the first thing I can do is to basically use this slider down the left-hand side to set the amount of this shape that I might want to use. So firstly, I can say, you know what, I don't like it at all, which means I can come down to 0%, in which case I get a flat EQ line, or I can come back to the sort of suggested 100%, or if I like the idea but want to take it even further, then I can go up to 200%, which is literally just doubling all of the values that it's analysed. So that's the first thing to say. The next thing is that there are actually 4 separate algorithms which I can use from a tonal perspective. So the one we're looking at right now is called transparent, but there are 3 others: clean, valve and punch. And what these do is to emulate the tonal characteristics that come from particular types of audio gear. So for example, if, and I think I might want to do that, this for this particular track, I decide to use the valve instead, what I'm going to get is all of the kind of tonal characteristics and additional harmonic content that come from running sounds through hardware EQs that have valves in them. What valves tend to give us is this kind of extra harmonic saturation. It's a really nice warm way of kind of treating the tonal aspects of our tracks. And so we can see that basically there are 4 different ways that we can effectively process the tonal characteristics of our tracks, and they're really worth experimenting with. So I'm going to stick with valve. So firstly, I'm going to just press play. However, it's not only going to be the tonal difference that we're now going to hear, because in addition to the EQ, I can see that there is a dynamics module up here, which has also been engaged as a result of Mastering Assistant switching on. We've also got a stereo spread option, which is here as well. So everything is going to be different about this mix. And I've talked for such a long time that what I'm actually going to do is to put a loop round this section here, and we're going to start with the whole plugin bypassed, and then I'm going to press play. And yes, we'll hear the tonal change, but we're going to hear a big volume difference too, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, finally, here's some music, and then we'll punch it in. delays. Okay, so you can hear that there is a massive difference between the character of these different tonal shapes. And actually, I thought I'd like the valve one. I think I like the clean one better. We're not getting the kind of, well, anyway, this just definitely feels a little bit more solid and punchy to me. Okay, so we've already seen that. The analysed sort of section of the track that we've been working on has produced this kind of automatic EQ for us. But what we can also do is to go one step further, which is to overlay a custom EQ of our own on top of these suggested changes. What exactly does that mean? Okay, well, let's look at the bass end for a moment. I can see that the suggested bump here is at around, I'm guessing that's probably about 40 hertz, or maybe if that's 20 and that's 50, maybe this is more like 42 hertz. Anyway, nevertheless, I can see that there's a bump that's suggested. Fine. But what if what I also wanted to do is to say, yeah, I like that bump, but what I really want to do is to also have a kind of low shelf, which is bringing some extra volume to a broader range of low-end frequencies. Well, I can do that by turning on the custom EQ. And what this allows me to do is to toggle between, you can see this kind of grayed out line in the background, which is the opportunity for me to put in an additional EQ curve. And if I start manipulating this, what's going to happen is that sure enough, I get at the low end a low shelf. And what this is doing is basically raising low frequency content volume, including the suggested auto EQ bump, but also allowing me to just manipulate the way that the bottom end might work. And similarly, if I decide that actually the bottom end's too proud, too loud, then I've obviously got a chance to roll it off from that perspective as well. And I can see the frequency that's basically acting as the central frequency for this shelf, and I can see the amount of gain that's being applied depending on how I want to work. So I'm going to just warm up the bottom end a little bit. And I've got two more nodes as well. So we've got a mid gain, and we've also got a high shelf. So I've got an opportunity to sort of inflict a little bit of my own decision making as far as the EQ is concerned if I want to, or I can just stick with the auto EQ. And at any point, of course, I can just punch this in and out. My settings will be remembered. And I've got an opportunity to compare my own EQ overlay on top of the auto EQ. So hopefully that makes sense. And remember, we've got auto EQ and we've got a slider to control how much of that we want to use. We can accentuate it if we want to a little bit, and we've got our custom EQ, which is our choices overlaid on top of everything else. So what I'm actually going to do is to come back to here a moment and just make sure that my little bump is where I left it. Okay, fine, all good. So that's the EQ section. What we're going to do now is to look at dynamics. Okay, so I always get a little bit nervous about the idea that we can control dynamics from one dial called loudness. What exactly is going on here? Well, if you're familiar with the adaptive limiter, have we made a video about the adaptive limiter? I'm wondering if we've made a video about the adaptive limiter. In fact, actually, I think someone asked this morning in the comments whether or not we'd make a video about the limiters. Maybe we haven't, so we'll fix that. But the adaptive limiter is Logic's main sort of, well, up until now, main sort of mastering Brickwall limiter, which effectively says, okay, I'm going to let volume get pushed. I'm going to let volumes get pushed in volume. In other words, we're going to get more and more level, but we're going to set what we call a Brickwall output ceiling, which means that we're going to make sure that volume can never exceed a certain point. Now this then taps into the idea of the way that we actually listen to music and how volume reaches us. We tend to think about the loudest peak moments as being the pivotal moments in the way that we listen to sounds, but actually it's average volume which our brain latches onto. If we can increase average volume, in other words, bring up the volume of the quietest moments, overall, our mixes sound louder. And this loudness control here within Mastering Assistant is doing exactly that. It's allowing us to say, okay, without ever exceeding a volume threshold, we can decide how much we want to push average volume, and that's what the loudness dial does. Okay, now a little while ago I mentioned fit for purpose in terms of controlling level relative to the platform that your music is going to go out into the world onto. Now, if you decide that you want to put your music out on Apple Music or on Spotify like everybody else is doing, then effectively it needs to adhere to a volume level. And different online platforms have different levels exactly in terms of how they broadcast music. And this value is referred to as LUFS, which stands for Loudness Units Full Scale. In other words, what it does is to say, okay, the volume that a track is allowed to reach is X. Now, actually, all of those platforms slightly vary. I forget which way around it is. I think Spotify is -14 LUFS, and I think Apple Music is -15. They might be the other way around. But Tidal has its own thing, and also so does broadcast TV, that effectively what we want to do is to make sure that the volume dial isn't something we're having to reach for as we listen to music. There's nothing worse than watching a TV show and suddenly the commercials being way louder than the thing that you're actually listening to. And the idea of LUFS is it acts as a kind of benchmark for volume. Now, again, lots of talking, but it's really important to understand this. So if you want to have your music go out on, let's say, Spotify, Spotify will make sure that your music does not exceed -14 LUFS. Now, you can do that. You can print your master making sure that that's the case, in which case when your music gets uploaded to Spotify, it won't change in volume. But if you've actually created a master which maybe reaches -2 LUFS, in other words, is 12 dB too loud for that platform, Spotify will automatically bring its volume down. And there's a really interesting whole kind of PhD thesis of a conversation we could have about that in terms of which music translates well to online platforms and which music translates less well. And certainly the more dynamic it is, it tends to do better. Okay, so how do we actually measure LUFS? Well, we measure them from start to finish, and that's a really crucial point. From the moment your track starts until the moment it ends, we end up with a number which is referred to as an integrated LUFS measurement. And so long as over the entire track, including the fade out, important point, your volume doesn't exceed -14 LUFS, Spotify isn't going to touch it. Okay, so what we've got a chance to do is to set a range around our whole track and to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to start reading the LUFS measurement, which I can do by pressing start here and pressing play. Okay, so my track stops there, which means that my LUFS measurement is -13.7 from an integrated LUFS point of view. So if I uploaded this track to Spotify, it would get turned down 0.3 dB. Does that make sense? Okay, now, as you can see, or if you want to watch that back, what you'll discover is that the intro, including this kind of 8 bars at the front, is all outside that range. I think it basically peaks at about -15 dB from an integrated LUFS perspective. It's only when we get into the kind of meat of the track where the beats and the bass are at their loudest that obviously we start to lose that. But if I was to go on and program this track and have an extended drop in the middle, come back to another repeat of this, but then maybe have a longer outro, it's entirely possible that without me having to change any levels, the integrated LUFS measurement over the entire duration of the piece would be around -14, in which case no volume adjustment would be made by the online platforms. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay, so how would I change volume? Well, that's what the loudness dial is for. Effectively, by backing this down, I could turn the overall volume down a little bit, and I could restart my LUFS measurements by resetting this button and running it all over again. So that's effectively what we've got. The loudness dial is effectively acting as a one dial volume increaser. And next to that, I've got the opportunity to decide how I want to monitor level. And that section here, the LUFS measurements, are, in my opinion, more important than the peak measurements, which are effectively looking at the loudest moments. Useful to make sure that your mix isn't overloading, but it's much more about the overall integrated volume of the track through the entire piece that is more important. And we've also, in this dynamics section, just before we move on, got this excite button, and that literally acts like an exciter. It's going to give us a little bit of extra fizz, a little bit of extra kind of fizz and tiz at the output stage. And again, if I don't like it, I can turn it off. And in fact, it's been off, but we can engage it and bring in a little bit of extra excitement if we want. I'm not going to experiment with that too much now. I might when we play back through in a moment. But again, I'm always a little bit wary of buttons that basically do something significant, which I don't have any further control over. So if I want to really excite the mix, I would probably put the exciter in the channel strip a little bit earlier on. And guess what? It already is. So it's here. So that would be up to me to decide whether or not I want to bring a little bit of extra kind of color to the top end. So that's fine. Okay, what I've then got is the opportunity to bring in some stereo widening. So stereo widening is all about how much we want to add volume to the channel content that is discrete to the left and right hand channels. So in other words, we want our mix to be nice and mono compatible. In other words, we want to make sure that we haven't just got a mix where we've got an enormous amount of bias from one side to the other. We don't want to put our bass line just on the left, for instance, so that it's missing from the right-hand channel. The core of that sound and the kick drum and probably the vocal is going to want to be in the middle of the mix and highly mono compatible. But it's also true that reverbs and synths and stereo drum placements, if we've actually been recording drums, provide us with this really nice stereo sound. And if we increase the volume to the stuff that is different between the left and right channels, the overall sense of stereo widening increases in our mixes, and suddenly everything feels a bit more cinematic and widescreen. And again, we've got an opportunity just to decide how much of that we want to use. So I'm going to do two things now. We're going to put our loop background here. The first thing we'll do is to punch in the exciter module and see what that does, and we'll also play around with stereo width. And by the way, you might be thinking, okay, what's this correlation meter? That is showing us the phase correlation of our mix. In other words, have we got phase issues which are creeping in, either that are already present in the mix or that are made worse by us playing around with stereo width. And broadly speaking here, we want to make sure that our mix from a phase perspective is over here on the right-hand side in the nice friendly green area. What we don't want to be doing is getting into the red or even the amber. That's bad. So we want to make sure that effectively that's what we're doing. And that's showing us, our correlation meter is showing us the phase coherence between the two sides of our mix. Okay, let's press play and punch in these modules. Okay, that's really interesting. It's so easy. This is true broadly when mixing, certainly true when mastering it, and particularly if you're mastering or mixing at the end of a long day of writing, to be completely seduced by the kind of fizz and excitement that can come from the top end, because it's exciting and our ears get tired, and suddenly that's what we want. It's kind of a little sugary rush. And obviously our exciter button is going to give us that, and the idea of then turning up the volume by using the stereo spread of that outer channel stuff, very easy to just go, okay, that sounds better, right? And then you press bypass, go back to your original mix, punch it back in, and are amazed by just suddenly how toppy the whole thing sounds. So be careful with that stuff. Okay, so the last thing we've got here is this loudness compensation button. And what this allows me to do, if I actually have loudness that I've pushed in, I think, is to switch in and out exactly what that's doing as part of the overall mastering assistant treatment. So we weren't hearing any change there because I didn't have any additional loudness pushed in. So we're going to do that just for fun. We already know that any louder I make this track is going to make it incompatible with online streaming platforms, but we'll ignore that for a moment. Just pretend we're going for CD, and it's the good old days of the early 90s when all that mattered was maximum volume. And we'll dial in some more, and then we'll see what this button does. Okay, so yeah, as I suggested, effectively what that allows us to do is to hear everything that Mastering Assistant is doing except for the loudness boost. Interestingly, look what happens to our integrated LUFS level when we push that loudness as hard as we are at the moment. Obviously, no longer is Spotify our friend. So Mastering Assistant, I'm obviously extremely careful on this channel not to sort of use videos like this as a kind of review of a plugin. I don't think that's my job. I think my job is to tell you how these things work and for you to go away and experiment with them. There's absolutely no doubt that what I think this plugin can do is potentially really useful as far as your mixes are concerned. I always get a little bit nervous about the idea of dials that basically do lots of things but only present you either with a rotary dial or a button, and they don't let you get into the details. But it is absolutely true that I think the analyze EQ is quite a powerful tool. And obviously there's no getting past the fact that obviously this kind of a processor has come from plugins like Ozone, which everyone was really sniffy about when it first arrived because it appeared to be a kind of, oh, look, well, you can just slap on a preset and suddenly you've got a mastering solution, but actually has gone on to become a really sophisticated set of tools. And I think that there is some real sophistication in what's going on here as well. So definitely worth a play without any question whatsoever, and one for you to go and experiment with. But I would say that my overall thought about it is cautiously positive. There you go, that sort of sounds like a bad band name or a terrible album title. Anyway, go and have a play with Mastering Assistant. Hopefully now it makes a little bit more sense.